In this video, we're going to go over the basics of primary sources. We're going to start with defining primary sources. Then we're going to look at some examples. And then we're going to compare some primary sources versus secondary sources. A primary source is an original record created at the time a historical event occurs. A record does not mean a phonograph album. It means a document or a piece of artwork or an article of clothing. It was just something that was created at the time when something in the past occurred. And a historical event does not need to be something famous, such as the Gettysburg Address or the I Have a Dream speech. It's merely something that happened before this moment. So for example, if you went grocery shopping yesterday, that was the historical event. And the primary source that was created is your receipt that shows what you purchased, when you purchased it, and where you purchased it. One caveat is somebody who was an eyewitness to an event and later recounts it in a memoir or an oral history or an autobiography. That is also considered a primary source. A primary source has not been filtered or interpreted or evaluated. That is done by scholars and researchers who use primary sources to support their hypotheses and or their research. Let's look at some examples of primary sources. Some are obvious, but there are many others that you might not have even thought of. Let's start with some obvious primary sources. Here we have a handwritten letter, but bear in mind it can also be created electronically, such as a Word document or an email. As I mentioned earlier, eyewitnesses who later recount the events in a memoir or an autobiography or an oral history are also primary sources. Diaries and journals are also very popular primary sources. Here we have Anne Frank's diary, but you will notice that it's in book form. Obviously, Anne Frank's diary was originally handwritten, but it was transcribed and published in many different languages for wider distribution. Just because something was published does not make it any less of a primary source. Another very popular primary source are photographs. In this photograph, we see a classroom from the turn of the 20th century. Someone doing research on one-room schoolrooms can use this photo as part of their research, whereas another scholar who is researching the clothing that children wore at that time could use this photograph for their research. The beauty of primary sources is that the same item can be interpreted and used for many different topics. There are many items that most people don't realize are primary sources. For example, a mugshot, poetry, a report card, sermons, concert tickets, and many more if you think a little outside the box. I'm going to provide some examples of primary versus secondary sources. An example of a primary source is government documents, such as census records, hearings, and speeches given on the floor of Congress. Political commentary, however, are secondary sources. Depending on whether a media outlet is conservative or liberal, the same events are interpreted and presented in many times radically different. Newspaper articles are many times primary sources, but this is a case where you definitely have to use critical thinking skills. Many people think that a newspaper account created at the time a historic event occurs is automatically a primary source. But in fact, many columns are a recounting of that historical event, and the writer was not present at the time that event occurred. Whereas newspaper op-eds, those are secondary sources. It is usually just somebody's opinion. However, they are primary sources if the subject of your research is public opinion at the time an event occurs. Home movies, those are unequivocally primary sources. Movies and books based on historic events are secondary sources. They can be quite misleading because a movie or a book claims to be based on true events. However, that writer or director may use literary license or add fictional characters to embellish the story. Twitter feeds are primary sources. Although they may be deleted, they cannot be doctored. It depends whether a YouTube video is a primary or a secondary source. It takes critical thinking on behalf of the viewer to ascertain if this is indeed a factual representation of what it purports to be. We've all heard of Photoshop. We all know about deep fakes. Your books are fabulous examples of a primary source. Researchers use them all the time for a myriad of reasons. However, textbooks are usually considered secondary sources. But like newspaper op-eds, if your research topic is about curriculum from days past, then textbooks would be a primary source. As you can see, primary sources are quite nuanced. If you have any doubt about whether something is a primary source, it is always best to do additional research to confirm that the item is factual. Let's recap. First, we define primary sources. It is an original record created at the time a historic event occurred. Then we looked at some examples of primary sources. Some were obvious, such as a letter or a photograph or a diary. Others were not quite so common. We looked at a mugshot, a concert ticket, and a poem. And last we compared some primary and secondary sources. As you discovered, primary sources are quite nuanced. In some situations, a record is a primary source, but in other situations, it is a secondary source. It is up to you to determine if indeed what you are using is a primary source.